Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 70. Today we'll be discussing the Charbono grape. Brad Kurtz from episode 64 put the idea into my head to do some grape-focused episodes, and Charbono seemed like a good place to start. It was planted early in California's viticultural history, and abundantly. It's worth mentioning that soon after, plantings were being tried of every grape any grower could lay their hands on. We're kind of picking up the story once people started studying a wide range of the plantings and finding out how all the options fit together, what grapes should stand on their own, which could blend well with others, which viticultural areas grew each variety the best. Charbono was planted in some of the best vineyards California had to offer, but then the knives and the pruning loppers came out. I want to stress that no matter what is said in this episode, I don't dislike the grape. Most of these opinions are 150 years ago. I put it in the camp of many other grapes that might have been mishandled or just not given a fair shake, or were maybe just not what folks were looking for at the time. Mission, Valdegi, Zinfandel, Carignan, or some others you could say the same thing of. With the exception of Mission, I can't think of another vine that seemed so hated at the time. Even then, some of the better growers knew the true value of the grape and that much of it was planted on the wrong soils. Mataro and Zinfandel were spoken about in the same way often. Special thanks to episode 53 guest Kenny from Hobo Wines for giving me a modern-day winemaker's take on the grape, and episode 21 guest Daniel Callan from Slime Dance Cooperative Wines for some other details. A quick reminder that there's a Patreon at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast. The link is in the show notes also. Any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. Telling a friend is a great way to help out too. Here we go. The Charbono, having fully justified in the valleys of California its French reputation of producing a rank-tasted, low-quality wine, is deservedly falling into disfavor for such localities, and is being grafted over to better varieties. At some points, however, it shows qualities that will continue to commend it for certain purposes, notably for deep color and tannin. This is how Professor Hilgard described the subject of today's episode in the Report of the Viticultural Work of 1885 and 1886. Most others felt the same. There had been lots of Charbono put in the ground. Whatever other grapes most growers could find were also tried at this time. The Charbono grape was imported from the Jura in the 1870s by both J.H. Drummond of the Dunfermline Vineyard in Glen Ellen and Jean-Baptiste Jules Portal, or JBJ Portal, who was located in San Jose, in the heart of the Santa Clara Valley. He had been importing vines from France since at least 1872 for his Burgundy vineyard. Portal became a mainstay in the early university reports by supplying grapes for their winemaking experiments. Like his 1885 Ploussard. Number 438, Ploussard, 1885, from JBJ Portal, West San Jose. A bright, heavy-bodied wine of intense purple-red color, has a bitterish taste which is above the astringency and a peculiar bouquet, not very strongly developed. Acid, inadequate. Astringency, pronounced. Alcoholic strength, not very high. General quality of sample, rather low except as to color. Or his Cabernet Franc or Cabernet Pfeffer. I don't think he knew which one it was yet, and others might not have either. Number 43, Cabernet Franc, or Pfeffer's Cabernet, 1884, from JBJ Portal, West San Jose. A clear, heavy-bodied wine of red color, strongly vinous flavor, and distinct bouquet peculiar to this wine, but acidified. Acid high, astringency and alcoholic strength high. General quality high apart from acidification. Dilution very good with 50% water, with 100% just passable. He supplied grapes and wines like this regularly to Professor Hilgard and the university. That is until about 1894 when he and his beautiful cousin left his wife alone with the vineyard and returned to France together. By then, his work had been done as far as Charbono was concerned. Another pioneer nurseryman we'll cover soon, Antoine Delmas of San Jose, was perhaps just behind the original two importers of the grape. so close that he could potentially be the first and was said to be in a few contemporary accounts. We'll get to him more in a future episode, though. Charbono had been seen as one of the new hopes of wine grapes in California, for sure to replace the hated Mission, especially in the Santa Clara Valley where it really took hold, and to a smaller extent in the Santa Cruz, Sonoma, and Napa valleys. Some have suggested the large Charbono plantings were a major cause of mediocre wine during the multiple 1800s wine depressions. You can, of course, also add overplanting in general, inexperienced winemakers working in unexplored viticultural areas, a need to sell the wine quickly, and many other things to that list. Some held out hope and planted the grape in a suitable environment, though, and made quality wine. Like John T. Doyle, another mainstay of the early viticultural reports and among the earliest citizens of Cupertino in the Santa Clara Valley. He gave the city its name. Doyle's early donation of 2 acres to the university in 1883 helped kickstart their experiments with grape growing and winemaking. We're going to cover Doyle in depth sooner or later, but it's fair to say his donation was one of the real turning points in California viticulture. Besides now having land in a premium wine-growing area to conduct experiments, it encouraged other growers to do the same, and soon you had Gallegos in Mission San Jose, and H.W. Crabb in Napa, not to mention the giant Natoma vineyard near Folsom, all new places where experimentation and wine growing could take place. Doyle's first large vineyard on his 320-acre property in what is now Menlo Park was originally nearly all Charbono. And he started his production with that grape, making his first wines and selling all 10,000 gallons of this first vintage of the Cupertino Wine Company at, quote, a high price, according to him. With time, much of this would be grafted over to other varieties as Charbono fell out of favor, giving the university more data points on how different varieties take to being top-worked. They were especially impressed by how Cab Franc did on the Charbono graphs. Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Malbec did acceptable, but not impressive. The results of his Charbono would be praised, but we can't be sure if it was the location or Doyle's care taken with his vines. Charles Wetmore said about Charbono in Doyle's vineyard, quote, "It reaches apparently its highest perfection." And Hilgard said, "And even at Cupertino, where Mr. John T. Doyle still maintains its culture as that of an important blending grape, its peculiar flavor being quite subordinate when well matured, its regular and abundant bearing is well maintained there." And others seem to think the same. At the 1885 San Jose Viticultural Convention, Santa Cruz Mountains winemaker and proponent of Charbono, John Stewart, who'd been, according to himself, quote, "doing battle for the Charbono a good deal of late, but am on my back at last," was told by a fellow winemaker, quote, "Yes, you can make a good wine of the Charbono. I don't deny that to you. But you won't make a better Charbono than Mr. Doyle's, and he can't sell his." Doyle was early in using it for a blending grape. By 1885, his Charbono and Malbec were more or less grown and made specifically as blending aids. Much of the Charbono had been grafted over to other varieties, but some always remained. Stewart as well would become known for his promotion of blending. Frona Eunice Waite, in her Vines and Wines of California book, remarked that the Santa Clara winemakers took pains to find grapes that would blend well with each other. Charles Wetmore was still selling Charbono vines amongst a dozen others as either cuttings or rooted. Riparia, Californica, and Arizonica rootstock for grafting, too. The only red grapes in Wetmore's area of Livermore that had larger plantings were Zinfandel, Krebs Black Burgundy, Mataro, and Chouche Noir. Malbec was about even with Charbono. He realized Charbono would never have the appeal of Zinfandel, but thought its color and productiveness would keep it around. When grown on warm, deep soils, he felt it would reach its peak and that it would suffer on the cold, clay soils, especially when overcropped. His overall thoughts were summed up as, quote, "It will not, however, advance the cause of viticulture beyond the supply of cheap, marketable product for everyday use," unquote. Of course, everyday use can still be a pretty good place for a grape to end up. H.W. Crabb of the Tokalon Vineyard would note in 1880 in George Hussman's book that although the mission was the grape that had kickstarted viticulture in California and was identical to the Pisca vine he had imported from Chile, both the mission and Pisca had been relegated to brandy making in his mind by now. The mission would also prove useful for Angelica, sherry, and Madeira wines in his estimation. He thought Riesling, Chasselas, and White Pinot, which is probably Chenin Blanc, were the standouts in the state for producing white wines due to, quote, their lightness, fineness, and delicacy of flavor, unquote. For red wines, he suggested Black Burgundy, Zinfandel, and Charbono were at the pinnacle. Quote, the first makes a dark, full-bodied, and richly flavored wine. The second has a fine raspberry flavor, but rather an excess of acid and is a little light in both body and color. The last one, like the Tinto, has but one characteristic color. Crabb's 1882 and 1883 Charbono were described as, quote, from H.W. Crabb, Oakville. Condition sample is bright with moderately intense purple color, a rather light body, and a decidedly fruity bouquet. Astringency adequate, and acid a little sharp. The character of the wine somewhat impaired by the casky flavor. And number 154A, Charbono, 1883, from H.W. Crabb, Oakville. Sample is clear, medium-bodied, and of intense purple color. Astringency fair, acid low, bouquet undeveloped, flavor fairly vinous. Dilution with 50% water results in a fair wine. With 100%, only tolerable, unquote. For the 1882 and 1883 vintages, Hilgard and the university conducted studies of red or claret wines from Mr. H.W. Crabb, Oakville, Napa County. They would test Zinfandel, Mataro, Charbono, Malbec, Crabb's Black Burgundy, Gamay Teinturier, Cabernet Sauvignon, Tannat, and more. This was their first chance to compare a range of varieties grown in the same soil as opposed to their usual style of analyzing the same grape but different growers, winemakers, localities, and even winemaking style. Quote, the wines of which the analysis are given were made by Mr. H.W. Crabb of Oakville, Napa County, from grapes grown by himself, on a soil of remarkable uniformity over a considerable portion of the upper Napa Valley. All the grapes here mentioned were fully ripe and were fermented on the skins until the first active fermentation was over, say from 5 days to a week, or sometimes more, unquote. The wines were judged on body, which they would calculate based on solids, alcohol level, which was measured by both volume and weight, acid, which was calculated based on tartaric acid, and the tannin level. The Charbono was the lightest bodied of the wines both years. 1883 was clearly a riper vintage for all the wines, and even the riper 1883 Charbono was somewhere near the middle of the pack. The alcohol level was also low. 2 of the 3 lowest levels belonged to Charbono. Acid was lowest on the Charbono for the 1882 vintage, but in the riper 1883 year, we see that it held acid well compared to some of the other grapes. Its tannin was middle of the pack, roughly the same as Cabernet Sauvignon, and again, the 1883 contained more tannin than the 1882. They didn't come to solid conclusions on all the varieties, but the Gros Blanc and Crabb's Black Burgundy rose in their eyes, with the former's components making it look like a great blending wine, especially for high-acid, low-tannin Zinfandels, and the latter's having a balance nearer to the French wines they had analyzed than some true French grapes like Malbec and Mataro had when being grown in Napa. In another analysis of wines from Santa Clara, we see Charbono start to lose some of its blending job. It's recommended to blend Mataro and Malbec with Zinfandel instead of Charbono with its, quote, innate and invincible coarseness, excluding it from the better class of blends, unquote. A common theme of early university reports is grapes arriving damaged from the vineyards they were sourcing from. Ripe grapes were hauled in horse-drawn wagons over rough, unpaved roads, often for multiple days. Charbono and Burger, with their fragile skins, are two that were called out as being especially damage prone. The shipping crates were even changed around 1886 to help account for this. Perhaps this had something to do with its early dismissal. 50 years later, during Prohibition, many other grapes would be ripped out when they didn't ship well. The ride on bumpy wagons, with sometimes up to 4 days between picking and crushing, wasn't kind to many grapes, but harder on some than others. This account here is similar to many others. Quote, "The grapes arrived in a good but somewhat bruised condition. The moldy ones were picked out and the rest crushed the same day." Unquote. Vineyard planting choices often disappointed Secretary of the State Viticultural Commission Charles Wetmore, who wrote, quote, "There has not been found a single bearing vineyard planted systematically with the varieties necessary to reproduce the types of Bordeaux clarets, Burgundies, Sauternes, Hermitage, Portuguese port, Spanish sherry, Madeira, or cognac." Unquote. He would praise General Nagley's brandy. Nearly everyone did. It was made in the Santa Clara Valley and possibly the finest in the state. Charbono was almost exclusively the variety used, with a little Trousseau and Riesling blended in here and there. I've seen it said Nagley imported his Charbono directly, getting rid of his Mission, Catawba, and Folie Blanche to plant more Charbono. Wetmore wasn't all the way against the grape for winemaking. He would still praise Charbono as a blending grape, along with Mataro, Trousseau, and Crab's Black Burgundy to fill in body, color, or tannin when combined with other wines. Later in life, he even advised growers in the San Diego area on vine growing and winemaking. At one point, he recommended that a possible blend of 2/5 Zinfandel, 2/5 Charbono, and 1/5 Grenache could yield a distinctive wine for their area. He wasn't all in either, however, also suggesting that Mataro and Carignan could replace the Charbono and Zinfandel, respectively. To his credit, he had an open mind about blending and introducing California wines to those who might not have experience with them. Quote, "The market for our fine Zinfandel, in places where the taste is cultivated for French Claret and Burgundy types, would no doubt be increased by a judicious blend with favorite French varieties such as Charbono, Grenache, and Mataro, which, while not the finest of French grapes, are leading stocks for esteemed wines and are good bearers. The shy bearers, which produce grand French wines, may be experimented with at leisure after the market for ordinary table wine has been supplied." Unquote. He comes across almost disgusted at times that some of what he felt were premium varieties were ignored. Quote, "By the unfortunate system of selection adopted, the choicest of French, Spanish, and Portuguese varieties were sacrificed to the test of quantity of short pruning. The result has been that the original collections of noble stock were mostly lost to identification and forgotten by name until the organization of this commission, when a new impulse to systematic viticulture was given. The Trousseau was neglected for the Charbono, the Sauvignon Blanc for the Colombard and Folie Blanche, and the Bordeaux, Claret, and Burgundy stocks were practically abandoned, the small proportion existing being drowned beyond recognition of their quality in thousands of gallons of the coarser grades." Unquote. Some price lists for growers this year give us a view as to how this stood in their eyes. I suspect some of this was supply and demand. Charbono was plentiful, while other imports were newer and more scarce. But Charbono was going for about $15 a ton, while Zinfandel, Mataro, and Carignan were all $20. Petit Syrah and Alicante Bouschet were $30. Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc at $50 per ton. A couple poor Charbono crops around this time might have hastened its decline. The 86 and 87 vintages show many expecting low yields from the grape due to poor set. Offhandedly, Wetmore also mentions Charbono and its color-giving qualities. Quote, "There are valuable grapes which give deep color, such as the Charbono, but that is not their chief value, except to the small dealer who waters his wine." Unquote. Early on, many didn't know what to make of the grape. We see it in the Burgundy and the Bordeaux section of the viticultural reports. Wetmore again. We have no Burgundy plantations. It is too commonly the custom to call all heavy clarets Burgundies. The true Burgundy is the product chiefly of the Pinot family of grapes, just as the Rhine wine owes its reputation to Riesling, and Sauternes to the Sauvignon. In Santa Clara County is found a vineyard succeeding in reproducing the Sauternes type, but many places falsely naming their products Burgundy. The Charbono, Trousseau, Grenache, Carignan, and Mataro are not Burgundy grapes. The only true Burgundy grape in that district is one that is misnamed a Riesling, the Pinot Gris, called generally Grey Riesling. The Charbono and Trousseau are leading varieties from the Jura district of France, the wine of which ranks nearly with, but inferior to Burgundy. They need, however, the Pulsard to complete their blend." Unquote. He won't stand for the labeling of Mataro as upright Burgundy in Napa and Sonoma counties either. Charbono, for its part, was at times called Santa Clara Cabernet. It could seemingly bounce back and forth between grape types depending on the report. Quote, "In no group of grape varieties does greater confusion prevail in the state at this time than in that of the Pinots or true Burgundies. Not only is the same variety and the shape of numberless sports of the Pinot Noir of the ampliographies found under at least a dozen local names, but the name Burgundy is promiscuously applied to grapes having not the least resemblance to the Pinot, whether in leaf, bunch, berry, or wine. In the Santa Clara Valley, the Chousse Noir circulates under the name of Burgundy, and even the Charbono was thus designated by some growers. It will take some years of close study and comparison to unravel these synonyms and misnomers. And for the present, the grapes received under the name of Pinots or Burgundies are so designated in the text of this report, unless their true name is known to be otherwise." Unquote. Publications still grouped it with Burgundy grapes in 1885, even though they knew it not to be a true Burgundy grape. Quote, "Technically, the Burgundy should only include the noble family of Pinots, which should not be confused with many others called Pinot from different parts of France, such as the Petit Pinot of Santa Clara County, Crabbe's Black Burgundy, Trousseau, and Charbono, which however make good wines approximating good Burgundy." Unquote. Wetmore defends his position and explains why they are called Burgundies. Quote, "It is proper to say here that the term Burgundy as applied to wine is probably now purely conventional and has lost among our people its original meaning. Commercially speaking, it is now common to call any dry red wine having more than 12% of alcohol and being rich in body and flavor a Burgundy. In France also, the original distinction is being lost to the general consumer, and wines from the Jura and from Beaujolais are sent out as Burgundies. Hence, we are drifting into calling all the varieties cultivated from Lyon to Dijon Burgundy grapes. These grapes vary so much in quality and general characteristics of production that I deem it necessary here to make these remarks, because many ambitious young planters aiming to reproduce the wines of Chambertin, etc., true Burgundy as they know it in their travels, are being misled by our false nomenclature." Unquote. In 1887 to 1889, it was listed under Bordeaux or Claret type. Quote, "The Charbono, also known as Corbeau, is too well known to need description, and while its heavy and regular bearing rendered it a favorite in the early days of viticulture, its popularity has declined so far at this time that, with the exception of a few localities, it has very largely been grafted out. Its peculiar rankness is especially pronounced in the valley locations, but in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and even at Cupertino, it yields wine of very fair quality, esteemed on account of its deep tint, which makes it useful in bringing up the color of light-tinted red wines of the lower grades." Unquote. The Cupertino mention is in reference to Doyle. In reading through the reports, we see most of the Charbonos applied to the university growing in the Santa Clara Valley, Santa Cruz Mountains, Napa, and occasionally Sonoma, Livermore, and even Lake County. A representative sample from the Olivina Vineyard in Livermore. Quote, "From J.P. Smith, Livermore. Grapes arrived September 26, 1887, and were worked the same day. Bunches very characteristic, compact, almost no color, a few dried berries, seem to have suffered least in transportation of any of the varieties sent. The juice showed 21.43% of solid contents. Fermentation of 78 pounds crushed began promptly and reached its maximum of 80 degrees on the 29th, fermenting slowly without any violent action. It was drawn off on October 1st, 5 days from crushing. The yield was at the rate of 154 gallons per ton. The wine cleared rapidly, but developed slowly and did not attain a satisfactory quality, although keeping well. It was low in acid, with thin body and high astringency. And while comparatively free from the peculiar rankness of the variety, did not acquire a pronounced bouquet." Unquote. Or from Henry Mell of Glenwood in the Santa Cruz Mountains, quote, "Record of tasting, June 17th, 1886. Hilgard. A bright, intense purple-red wine of moderate body and rather pleasant, not rank bouquet. The acid in this wine is low, the astringency high. General quality, above medium." Unquote. They were especially impressed with some of the Santa Cruz Mountains versions, like the 1885 vintage of D.C. Feely of Patchen and H.P. Gregory of Sequel. Quote, "The above analysis shows fairly the composition of the Charbono wines from the Santa Cruz range, where this variety seems to yield its best product. The high tannin and color of the Sequel sample are quite remarkable and speak strongly in favor of that region for the production of important blending wines." Unquote. Even as phylloxera came through the mountains, destroying vineyards, some would replant their Charbono. In the case of Mr. Hoop's vineyard at Wright's Station, near Summit, he would replant onto the Texas Champigny rootstock and experienced, quote, "exuberant growth and heavy crop" after only a couple years. The grape spread northward from the Santa Clara Valley into the Fremont and Livermore wine-growing areas, where some was planted in the original Winty vineyard, first started by Dr. George Bernard, alongside Zinfandel, Mataro, Colombard, and Grey Riesling. This time, Grey Riesling is called Trousseau Gris, one of the winery's flagships for a time. In Napa, besides crabs planting, Alfred Tubbs grew it on 135 acres of his Hillcrest vineyard with Zinfandel, Golden Chasselas, Burger, Riesling, and more. At the 1888 Grape Growers Convention, the Santa Clara Valley and Napa reaffirmed their positions as the top producing areas. J.P. and R.T. Pierce of San Jose, along with M. Esty of Napa, won top prizes, joined by Beard and Putnam of the Warm Springs area of Fremont. Essentially an extension of the Santa Clara Valley in many ways at the time. It also traveled down to Los Angeles by way of Santa Clara. Sort of. Pioneer grower L.J. Rose of the Sunnyside Vineyard purchased from Charles Lafranc of the Almaden Vineyard an equal amount of cuttings of both Trousseau and Charbono. Labels were mixed up in some bunches, and a large amount of one variety died by, quote, exposure. Rose's wine from these vines was in high demand, and a renewed interest in Charbono took place, with many ordering cuttings from Rose himself. It wasn't until members of the Viticultural Commission toured Rose's vineyard when in town for a convention that it was discovered his Charbono was actually Trousseau. It was called, quote, "a notable case of survival of the fittest," unquote. Rose considered it a happy accident, but it wasn't a happy accident for everyone. A San Bernardino vineyardist writing a couple years after this event describes the exact story and how he purchased his 36,000 vines from, quote, "a well-known viticulturist in Los Angeles County," unquote. Instead of the Zinfandel, Trousseau, and Blue Ebling he had ordered, about 1/3 that were supposed to be Trousseau were true to name. A good bunch of them, though, were Blue Elbing. And the rest, quote, "the remainder consists of so many sorts that it furnishes an interesting field for the ampliography student. Some require long pruning, some short. Some are late, others early. Some are very dark in color, others very light, and all intermediate shades of color are well represented. Some are delicate and bear compact little bunches, others coarse and rank as the Mustang vine of Texas. There's much intermixture all through the whole lot and will lead to great inconveniences." Unquote. Charbono was also planted at the Amador, Paso Robles, and Tulare experiment stations, where the university's experiences with it were similar to what we've heard already. Lots of color, good tannin, medium-sized bunches and berries, a little slow to ferment dry and clear, and overall somewhat neutral tasting. Some of the limitations of the grape in Tulare would be due to the 9 acres per ton they were forcing from it. They appreciated its disease resistance and would often pick the slightly immature second crop at the same time as the first, enjoying the acid boost it gave and feeling like the fermentations went better. The second crop was hard to avoid in any event due to it coloring up quickly and looking pretty similar to the first. As they focused on getting closer to 5 tons per acre, quote, "The wine made was proportionally superior. The wine at 5 months was bright, of good color, full flavor, smooth, and agreeable," unquote. It was at Paso that they noticed some color deficiency, which wasn't unusual for them to see at the station, but also that the wine was aging poorly with low acids and low yields. Only about 1 pound per vine compared with 5 for Carignan, 6 for Pinot St. George and Mataro, and 8 for Crab's Black Burgundy. They were recommending it only for blending with lighter colored and astringent, high-acid wines. Quote, "It is likely to be of use, however, only to those with whom quantity is more looked for than quality," unquote. In Amador, the grape was found to yield about 4.5 tons per acre on both the red soils and the decomposed granite. Quote, "Charbono grows well and bears well, even on poor soil. It yields wines of good color but neutral in character and not of high quality. Very useful for blending with varieties of more astringency," unquote. Charbono had already been in the ground for over 10 years near the Tulare station. Martin Theodore Kearney, Abraham Lackman of the CWA, and more had planted over 350 acres to Charbono, Malvasia, Zinfandel, Fahir Zagos, Grey Riesling, and Palomino in order to make wine and brandy. In the style of the area, they also had an adobe cellar to help regulate the summer temperatures. Another vineyardist, Barton, also in the area, had his own 500 acres with Berger, Zinfandel, Charbono, and Malvasia as the main acreage. Professor Bialetti, when recommending grapes to be planted in California, had nothing but harsh words for the grape, and some others. In addition to recommending to not plant heavy-growing vines in the fertile valleys and low-yielding vines on hillsides and mountains, he had words about Charbono and some other friends. Quote, "Don't plant Mataro, Fahir Zagos, Charbono, Lenoir, or any variety that makes a poor wine everywhere," unquote. He instead, while allowing that consumers, growers, and winemakers all have different wants and needs, suggested Petit Syrah, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Beclin for reds, and Semillon, Colombar, aka Sauvignon Vert, and Sauvignon Blanc for white grapes. George Hussman also didn't think especially high of it, and for his part wrote of the grape, quote, "Charbono, vine very productive and hardy, bunch long, shouldered, of peculiar shape, berry medium, moderately juicy, but decidedly flat and coarse in taste. Makes a very dark red wine, and plenty of it, but of second quality, only valuable for blending and coloring, for which purpose I think the Lenoir far more valuable, and a much better wine," unquote. Antonio Pirelli Minetti, who we heard from much in the later California Wine Association episodes, would also describe Charbono in his book. He placed it in the grapes with colorless juice but abundant color in the skin section. Berry size, medium large and spherical. Black with a blue bloom, neutral flavor, and pulpy texture. The bunch is large but compact in density with shoulders. He, of course, goes all the way back to the CWA time. Henry Lackman, head of winemaking for the CWA during their heyday, described them getting an average of 4 to 6 tons in the valley and 2 to 4 tons in the hills, grouping Charbono in with Zinfandel, Grenache, and Mataro based on yields. Coming back to our everyday use quote from Charles Wetmore from earlier, The CWA would make good use of Charbono as a blending component, sourcing from vineyards far and wide, like Hugh McElroy's La Rue Ranch near Davis in Yolo County. This was a production vineyard of theirs, and the grape lineup reflects that. Burger and green Hungarian white grapes, and Alicante Bouschet, Carignan, Charbono, and Becklin for red. Grapes that would provide color, acid, tannin, or bulk up some million-gallon blends. Through all these notes, we see that the Viticultural Commission, university, and many prominent vineyards of the time never quite loved the grape. Some, it seems like they hated it, though they could still find some things that it did well. Large vineyards were fans of the Charbono. The giant Natoma vineyard from episode 40 had one of its large tracts planted to the grape. Leland Stanford planted Charbono at his even larger Vina vineyard, the largest in the world at the time. Even then, many knew the location in Tehama was much too hot for the grape to produce high-quality wines. Many of his other grape choices were no better. Much of this was sold to Kohler and Van Bergen, a large wine house in Sacramento, prior to them joining the CWA. H.W. McIntyre, who had designed the winery, had come from the Inglenook estate in Napa, and perhaps this influenced some of his grape variety choices. Much later on, after Inglenook founder Gustav Niebaum was long gone, and during the John Daniel Jr. years, Inglenook would be one of the holdouts to continue producing Charbono, making probably the first versions post-Prohibition with the varietal label. He specifically held back Charbono, Cabernet, and Pinot Noir for extra aging after bottling. During Prohibition, much of this would have gone into the sacramental wines they made. Inglenook's plantings had miraculously made it through Prohibition intact, although most believed the Charbono was Barbera until Albert Winkler from the University of California found out its true identity in the 1940s. Some have speculated that it was thought to be Barbera when first imported, but I don't really see any evidence of this. Portal was French, making most of his imports from there, and Drummond too relied heavily on French and German imports. And for the huge variety of grapes he had, Italian grapes were noticeably lacking compared to the other countries. Unless there was another importation, my guess would be that the varietal identity of the Inglenook planting was lost to time during the Prohibition years. Like others, the university had discovered the Charbono grew better in the Santa Clara Valley than in hot climates. Stanford discovered it too as his Charbono, but also Zinfandel, Trousseau, and Mataro fared much better at his Palo Alto ranch. The mix of grapes was relatively common in the area at the time. Sometimes you would see the blend include Grenache, or it would replace a grape, but Stanford's planting wasn't out of the ordinary by any means. Frederick Pondorf, who was so instrumental in some of the early university experiments, let his mind wander back to the wines based around the Mission and Charbono. Quote, "When Mission Reds were the staple clarets in California, how joyfully we put dark Charbono to it as the lighter and more neutral wine to mitigate the heavy Mission, which in its raw shape was so little accepted to a refined palate." Unquote. By 1890, industry publications were openly wondering about the future of the grape and others. This time, written by William Pfeffer, one of the more prominent growers of the time, quote, "The Charbono grape with the Zinfandel and Mataro form a trio of the most extensively planted grapevines. But how long will these bold the field is a question whether or not they have been planted in suitable soils, in which each one has its own preference towards the best possible results. It is evidently only a question of time when a faulty grown Zinfandel grape, as well as a poorly grown Charbono and Mataro, will not be profitable for cultivation." Unquote. By this time, Charbono was declining in popularity, and perhaps its strongest location, the Santa Clara Valley. Quote, "The Charbono variety, extensively cultivated in the past, has largely been eliminated and replaced by grafts of the Burgundy and Bordeaux types, greatly increasing the value of the products. Charbono has never been fully abandoned. Some have come and gone, like the post-Prohibition wines of the Sella Vineyard and their Napa Wine Company. Although the wines were produced in Oakville, Inglenook's home, they would bottle the wines in Reedley, south of Fresno. Buena Vista is another winery that blends it in too. As far as I know, it's not a grape that Augustin or Arpad Horosli claimed to have first imported. Inglenook has carried on the tradition more than any other, at least until somewhat recently. The Charbono Society they founded in 1981 with other like-minded wineries such as Parducci, Franciscan, Souverain, and Fortino was created to preserve and relish in Charbonos, old, young, and in the future. Some members of the society could still remember the tough, tannic wines of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and also found themselves enjoying the rustic and hearty but easier drinking 70s versions. When the society started, Inglenook's 40 acres of Charbono were over 85% of the grape in California. Fellow society winery Parducci blended its Charbono into their Pinot Noir. They thought the two grapes were related through the 30s and into the 40s. It wasn't bottled as a varietal by them until late in the decade. An unnamed winemaker in Livermore was said to have won awards at the state fair for their Pinot Noir that was really Charbono, according to former Souverain winemaker Tom Eddy. BV, too, took advantage of Charbono. It made up a large percentage of their special Burgundy blend most years. In 1990, it contained 50% Petit Syrah, 40% Charbono, 5% early Burgundy, and another 5% of Valdegui. There was also the Heights family that had an unusual dedication to the grape in their Napa Valley vineyards and supplied much of the fruit for those Inglenook bottlings. Episode 53 guest Hobo Wines also makes a great take on the grape. Kenny told me that he appreciates the rusticity of the grape and how that can make it a great pairing with a wide range of foods, and I tend to agree with that. To him, it harkens back to the old-time 60s and 70s California table wines, jug blends, or generics, whatever you like to call them. Wines that are also likely to contain Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, Carignan, Mataro, Valdegui, and some other California heritage varieties. Wines like that BV Burgundy we discussed. Hobo makes it with some whole clusters and native fermentation and aged in older oak from Sassoon Valley fruit that was grafted over from Merlot. Winemakers still enjoy it for darkening a blend, to add tannin, and its ability to be picked at moderate sugars with full flavor, allowing it to add a little freshness to certain wines despite its lower acid. Randall Graham, who would add dollops of it to many of his other wines, called it, quote, a sort of Venice MSG, if you will, unquote. In the 90s and 2000s, Gallo tested the variety amongst many others for its San Joaquin County-based Liberty project. The goal was testing varieties not known to have been grown in large scale in the county, and specifically Lodi. Their findings with Charbono follow. Quote, Charbono. California Charbono appears to be the Corbeau variety of southern France. Moderately vigorous vine, high yield, and very late ripening. Clusters are medium and fairly compact. Can make a nice wine of distinctive character as already proven commercially, but may still have low potential due to late harvest and lack of market recognition. Minor rot problems and very wet years will require cluster thinning for quality red program, unquote. The grape is very much at home in Argentina as well, second only to Malbec. They call our Charbono Bonarda, though it has no relation to the Italian Bonarda. There are now only about 5 acres or so in France and around 90 in California, but 19,000 in Argentina. Post-Prohibition winemakers and drinkers seem to respect Charbono so much more than pre-Prohibition. Perhaps it's that there were newer and shinier grapes always coming into production in pre-Prohibition California. The common theme through nearly all writings of that time bemoaned that wines need to be consumed so young and that winemakers can't afford to age wines before release. Post-Prohibition, the aging potential of Charbono was seen as a major plus. Sometimes it seems like they can go forever. Maybe one day we'll see it come out of disfavor. Thanks for listening today. It was fun diving into a grape like Charbono. I see it represented in nearly every historical episode I do, but aside from the few bottles and blends I've had, most of us don't get a chance to really dive into the grape and learn about it. I was actually a little surprised how much it was despised at times, but I enjoy the wine. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. Feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I love it if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast helps too. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses and allows for more episodes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.